Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome, Colorado Springs. I am Pete Lee, a board member for the Greenberg Center for Learning and Tolerance. I have the honor and privilege to introduce Alexander Hamilton. General Hamilton is a man whom some scholars have called the most brilliant of the founding fathers and the architect of our nation's greatness. Others, however, have called him a monarchist and a militarist. General Hamilton was a self-made man in an era when that term meant much. He rose from poverty and an ignoble birth to become a general, a leader, and the founder of the economic and legal system of the United States. Perhaps most impressive is the breadth of service of Alexander Hamilton. He served nobly in 3 arenas: in uniform, in office, and with his quill. After serving as Washington's closest aide, General Hamilton earned a combat command where he led troops from the front and was the first man over the walls during the climactic Battle of Yorktown. He was the nation's first Secretary of Treasury at the age of 32. There, he erected the foundations of the nation's fiscal system, putting us on the path to economic greatness. He was the principal author of the Federalist Papers, one of the greatest writings on American political thought ever crafted. In his later years, Talleyrand of France concluded that the 3 men he admired most were William Pitt, France's Napoleon Bonaparte, and America's Alexander Hamilton. Asked to rank these individuals, he said, "I would put Hamilton first." John Marshall once said that when he compared himself to Hamilton, he felt as a candle before the sun at noonday. His great adversary, Thomas Jefferson, called him the Colossus. John Adams called him far more disparaging names. Tonight, we are honored to call him our guest. General Hamilton will speak for several minutes and then invite your questions on subjects from his era and our own. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me to welcome General Alexander Hamilton.
Well, good evening, my fellow Americans. I greet you in that manner, for it is the highest praise that I may pay you. American, not Coloradan or Kansan, not New Yorker or Virginian, American. Alone among the founding fathers, I was not cursed with having a home state. Mr. Jefferson, my great adversary, once said, "What a difficult thing it is to be 300 miles from one's country." He was in Philadelphia, speaking of Virginia. In the magnificent library at Monticello, he had the law books of the other states under the heading Foreign Lands. And as President of the United States, referred to the government in Washington City as the Foreign Department. I am pleased to be with you because I never ventured to the American West, but I knew that we were destined to occupy it. I once wrote, "Our salvation as a nation depends upon men who are continental in their thinking." When Mr. Jefferson negotiated essentially a bribe of $14.2 million with the dictator Napoleon for what you call the Louisiana Purchase, I argued that for that same sum, he could have raised an army of 25,000, provisioned it for 25 years, and simply taken the land we were destined to occupy. He chose a different path. I did support his sending of Lewis and Clark, I will say. Mr. Jefferson had some unusual ideas. He believed, for example, that there was no such thing as extinction, so he told Meriwether Lewis, his secretary, that as he roamed the Dakota plains to keep a keen eye out for the woolly mammoth that he was quite sure still roamed the plains. He also believed in geographic symmetry, and he said, therefore, the Rocky Mountains will be essentially the same as the Appalachians. And he urged Lewis and Clark to allow at least 3 days to pass through the Rocky Mountains. Although I will say, with his great love of mathematics and geometry, he would have loved your state. We both agreed that we would be a continental nation, and he thought it would take at least 900 years for the first settlements to reach California. I believed him far too pessimistic. I suspected that within 300 years we would see villages dotting the California coast. What a pleasure to see what you have achieved. But I'm pleased to be with you for a number of reasons. I will explain that I had what one might call an awkward birth. And so I am here to correct the historical record. I am told that in your day, are there teachers in the room? I apologize, former teachers. I do not mean the insult vigorously that I'm about to give you. In your day, the founding of this country is poorly taught. It is often taught as memorizing names and dates, and those are important. But it is far more important, I believe, to understand the people that were behind this effort. If I say George Washington, quite likely your first image is of the portrait on your currency or his visage on a mountain in remote Dakota, perhaps a white marble statue in the nation's capital. Washington was to me in all ways but biology a father, and yet I said of him he is the most horrid swearer and blasphemer, a man capable of purple and volcanic rages. At the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse, General Charles Lee, who I am quite sure is no relation to the gentleman, Mr. Lee, who introduced me, was losing the battle. And as General Hamilton and I, as his aide, rode up to where the battle was taking place, General Lee came charging over and said, "Your men, sir, they will not fight." And Washington fixed him with an icy stare and said, "You goddamn poltroon," which means coward, "you have not tested them." And he led, and I rode with him into battle and rallied the troops and saved the day. And in that battle, 2 buttons were shot off of General Washington's coat. Had a single British soldier aimed 2 inches to the right on that day, it would mean that you today would all be Canadians. Because George Washington was the indispensable man. So I'm pleased to be here in efforts to correct the public record. I'm also pleased to be here because I shall admit that near the end of my life, a shadow had fallen across it, a dark, deep shadow. And I could not know if that was a brief eclipse or a long winter's night. In my private life, I had suffered ruin. My finances were in disarray. I was in debt, not to the extent of Mr. Jefferson. But nonetheless, I had purchased a 30-acre farm in Harlem, and in 3 years succeeded in raising some $18 worth of asparagus and strawberries. And I would write to a friend that I am as ill-suited to be a farmer as Mr. Jefferson is to be at the helm of the nation. I mentioned my birth. I was born in the Caribbean. My mother, Rachel, had been at the age of 16 compelled into marriage against the man she detested. Under the Dutch law of the time, she had no rights. And she bore him a son, my half-brother Peter, but then she fled and she met my father, James Hamilton. And they were married in all important ways except, of course, for legal, which made my brother James and I illegitimate. In fact, the records of my birth were marked with the phrase in large red letters, "obscene child," to ensure that I would never be allowed to attend what you would call public schools, where my presence as a bastard would somehow contaminate the children. So I grew up with a deep and profound sense of honor. Indeed, those who criticize me point to my first extant letter, I should say, to my friend Ned Stevens, contains the line, "Neddy, I wish there was a war." And I've been accused of being a militarist because of that. But they leave off the first part of that sentence, in which I say, "I would risk my life, but not my character to exalt my station. Neddy, I wish there was a war." Because for someone born in absolute poverty like myself, the military offered a path to some level of achievement. When I was roughly 10 years old, my father left on a business trip, which was to last some 3 months. He was gone for 32 years. I never did see him again, although in his old age I supported him. Not long after, my mother and I were both taken ill with what we called an ague. You would probably call it a tropical fever. We were given the most advanced medical treatment of the time. We were bled repeatedly to allow the ill humors to exit the body. I survived the treatment, but my mother did not. And so I was essentially orphaned. I was put in the care of a cousin who, within 3 weeks, hanged himself. And I would drift here and there until finally a kind merchant named Nicholas Kruger took me in, and I began working for, and by the time I was 14, running his, what you would call, International Import-Export Corporation. And so I sought to achieve through my intellect. Now, I will admit, I should explain, I am not a modest man. I once wrote to a friend, "I am aware that I have a good heart and good manners. I only wonder why I am not more handsome." But I was, I flatter myself, brilliant. And it was among the leaders of the island decided that I must be properly educated. So a collection was taken up, and I was sent to, in 1773 on the USS Thunderbolt, to the colonies. Now, because I had not been allowed to attend school, I had read every book available, devoured my mother's library, but when my mother died, her first husband arrived, and under the law seized everything, 32 books, 16 silver spoons, and a few other trinkets, leaving me utterly destitute. And so I worked as hard as I could, selling rum and other things as part of this Import-Export Corporation. And in 1773, having self-educated, I arrived at the Youngstown Institute in New Jersey, where I would seek to complete what you would call your kindergarten through 12th grade as quickly as possible, so that I could attend college at the College of New Jersey, now known as Princeton. And I approached the Reverend Witherspoon, who was the president of the school, and I said, "I am better than any student you've had before. So I would like to take the courses I wish, in the order I wish, in the manner I wish, and when I am finished with your school, I will tell you, and you may award me my degree." He was agreeable. He took it to the Board of Trustees, though, who remembered a young man several years my senior, not quite as brilliant, who had attempted such a compressed study plan and had what you would call a nervous breakdown. His name was James Madison. And as a result, I was declined admission. I did attend to Princeton. I made the same offer to be allowed in. I was declined, and then I attended King's College, now Columbia University, when the war broke out. I did have one further intercourse with Princeton. At the Battle of Princeton, I was a captain of artillery. I had 68 cannon overlooking the field. Are there any graduates of Princeton in the room? There are none, just as well. The building called Nassau Hall, which I'm told stands in your day, was the only building of substance on the campus of Princeton University. The British officers fled into Nassau Hall, making it a legitimate military target. The institution of Princeton University became a legitimate military target. Did I mention I have 68 cannon? So on that day at least, what to do, I did achieve a rather dramatic admission to at least one room of Princeton University. But I'm pleased to be with you in your day because of the shadow I mentioned a little bit ago. In my private life, the most horrid thing had happened. My son, Philip, my firstborn of 8 children, a remarkable young man. At the age of 18, he heard a gentleman named George Aker, who was a Jefferson minion and a radicalist. And he heard Mr. Aker give a speech in which Aker claimed that I, his father, would not object to a military dictatorship. Now, I will tell you that during the Revolutionary War, I twice had horses shot out from under me as I was rescuing Congress from capture by the British. I am told in your day that is not entirely a positive notion, but were I a monarchist, I would not have done so. And sadly, my son Philip, listened to Mr. George Aker, and he drank too much one night at the theater. He saw Mr. Aker there and began making comments, and Aker finally said that he'd had enough, and he began the process of what we called, eventually a duel, but it was called an interview, a process, an affair of honor, which could lead to a duel, such as I had with Colonel Burr, should someone later be bold enough to ask that question. And my son was 18 years old. And I had taught him about honor. And he disappeared one day. He was gone in the morning. And I happened to go visit my friend David Hosack, the family physician, and he was gone. And the only reason they would both be gone is if they had decamped to Weehawken, New Jersey, a bluff above the river where duels took place. Now, knowing my son was facing a duel, I gave him one piece of advice. I said, a gentleman throws away his fire. And that means that as you stand facing this, you do not stand facing the person, of course, presenting as small a target as possible. A gentleman shoots over the other man's head to indicate, I could put your life at risk, but I choose not to take a life. And I now put myself at your pity. Well, my son raised his pistol, Mr. Aker raised his, and in a duel, generally, you have ready, present, fire, and you fire quickly. But neither man did. And for a full minute, they aimed at each other. And then my son raised his pistol to the sky, and Mr. Aker fired. My son would die the next day in a bed between his mother and me in agony. My eldest daughter, Angelica, would lose her mind with grief over the loss of her brother, and for the remainder of her sad life, wore the clothing of 1802 and would sit at the pianoforte playing the songs of that year over and over and over. 50 years later, when she died, her sister remarked on a sad and tragic and utterly wasted life. I mentioned the debt, and I mentioned the shadow. So what a pleasure to be with you in your day to see that it was, in fact, just a brief eclipse. In my public life, my great adversary, Mr. Jefferson, was president with my help. In the election of 1800, the dirtiest election in American history, you believe your elections today are somehow vile. In my day, there was a broadside, that is to say, a poster, which was essentially the political advertisement of the day. And it read this. It said, if the atheist Jefferson is elected, every Bible in America will be seized and burned, every virgin deflowered, and the streets will run red with the blood of murdered patriots. That, dear friends, is a negative ad. And in the first blatantly political act in American history, Mr. Jefferson had to select a running mate to be his vice president. Recall that Mr. Washington served 2 terms and left. Mr. Adams served 1 term and wanted to serve another one, but he was incompetent and foolish. Oh, he was an interesting fellow. The first 3 weeks of the first session of the United States Senate, which he presided over as vice president, were devoted to determining by what title he should be called. Your most excellent Vice President, His Excellency the Vice President and President of the Senate. 3 weeks on this title. He called me a number of things. He called me the most indefatigable intriguer in the United States and perhaps in the world. He called me that little man, though I was taller than he. And most famously, he called me the bastard brat of a Scotch peddler. I simply called him your rotundity. But Mr. Adams was president, and Mr. Jefferson was running against him. He will deny that he was running, but he, as I said in the letter, most urgently quested after the presidential chair. And he knew that because of the abomination that was the 3/5 clause in the Constitution, that he would have the votes from the South that he needed. But he was unsure, given Mr. Adams' strength in the Northeast, if there were enough electoral votes in the North to give him the presidency. So he chose Aaron Burr as his running mate. Now, this is before the 12th Amendment corrected the problem which I'm about to describe. The 12th Amendment now has the president and the vice president running as a single ticket. But back then, they were voted for in the Electoral College. When General Washington faced the first Electoral College, he was unanimously picked. And when Mr. Adams was put forward as vice president, one member symbolically withheld his vote, giving him one fewer vote than Washington, making Washington president, Adams vice president. The same laws applied in 1800. The problem was that under this system, they tied Burr and Jefferson in the Electoral College at 73 electoral votes each. Now, Burr realized that he was only one changed vote away from becoming president rather than the worthless position of vice president. And for 35 ballots in the House, with each state having one vote, no resolution came forward. I could stand it no more, and I took my quill and I wrote to William Bayard, the delegate of Connecticut, and I said of Jefferson, "It is true that his politics are tinctured with fanaticism, that he was the principal mischievous enemy of the primary measures of the previous administration, that he is not mindful of his means of success, nor is he careful about his truth, and he is a contemptible hypocrite. But," I said, "compared to Burr, he is by far not so dangerous a man, and he has pretensions to character." Of Burr, I wrote that he is for or against nothing that suits his interest and ambition. If there is an embryo Caesar in America, 'tis Burr. I said, Burr loves only one thing, and that is himself. He seeks only one thing, and that is personal aggrandizement. And all he cares about is seizing and keeping permanent power. So, as I said, the delegate from Connecticut withheld his vote. Mr. Jefferson became president. Mr. Burr became the vice president, who was disquieted with me. And Burr had the audacity to approach President-elect Jefferson to say, "We've both been elected, what duties shall I have?" And Jefferson said, "None." Burr would then run for governor of New York 2 years later. I would again intervene and thwart it, and he was again off put. But in your day, I see that you have thrown off the Jefferson nonsense. The Jefferson music was remarkable. The greatest writing on political theory ever is his Declaration of Independence. Those remarkable 36 words, which we begin with, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal," is a phenomenal statement never before made in human history. But his ideas were nonsense. He believed in what a system he called ward republics, where 20 families would be organized in small groups and would have most of the power, and as you ascended to state and national government, less and less power would be available. And this is what happened under the Articles of Confederation, where you had states who could veto any action of the national government. One state in particular, who we referred to as Rogue Island, vetoed everything. And under the Articles of Confederation, the states were, as I wrote, petty, jarring, jealous, and perverse. Because having not had a home state, I firmly believe that your rights as an American should not vary based on the accident of the geography of your birth. If you were born a mile into Kansas or a mile into your Colorado, your rights should be identical as Americans. This was a radical notion in my day. But happily, we did come up with a Constitution. I was one of 3 New York delegates. The other 2 were anti-federalists and voted me down 2-1 on virtually everything. But we carved out a document which I would later say is a thing of milk and water, a frail and worthless fabric I spent my life propping up because it was not strong enough. But we did achieve a Constitution. Now, the political compromise that was required was the addition to give cover to the anti-federalists of a foolish and dangerous idea you call the Bill of Rights, a compromise we had to make at the time. And as I understand in your day, it is the longest surviving written constitution in American history, in the world history, which is remarkable. Jefferson believed you should tear up the Constitution every 19 years and begin again. It's a foolish idea, but much of his thinking was foolish. And in your day, as I say, you are a thoroughly Hamiltonian nation. You have thrown off the Jefferson decorations and have become truly the greatest nation on earth that has ever been on earth, I will say. You are the strongest, richest, most powerful nation ever to exist. And you owe some of that, I flatter myself, to me. Because under the Constitution, which was itself, I wrote in the Federalist Papers, a Bill of Rights. It had 28 different individual rights enumerated in it. We became a nation in which we didn't say the United States are, we said the United States is. A change of but one letter that made all the difference in our nation. And so, I am pleased to see that you are here tonight basking in a Hamiltonian world. Now, every now and then there is someone, perhaps the person who just giggled is one, who sometimes say, "Oh, Mr. Hamilton, wouldn't we be better if we were in Mr. Jefferson's idyllic world? Jefferson thought we would farm during the day, and at night we would read Livy in the original and play our violins and barter with our neighbors for what we did not have. We would be an agrarian utopia." And I say, this sounds compelling. What are you willing to give up to live in Mr. Jefferson's agrarian utopia? Are you willing to give up the products of an industrial nation? And I say, will you give up your entertainment machines? And they always say, oh yes, we only use it to watch PBS. And then I say, will you give up the refrigeration of your food? A product of an industrial nation. And they pause. And I say, will you give up your children's antibiotics? 4 of Mr. Jefferson's 6 children died before the age of 5 from illnesses that in your day are cured by a single visit to a physician. Of the remaining 2, he lost a daughter in childbirth and would write, "All that I am now hangs from a single thread." That is the price of a Jeffersonian utopia. Fundamentally, for all the differences we can cite on documents and notions and laws, our difference comes down to one fundamental difference: our view of human nature. Mr. Jefferson believed that if government would simply get out of the way, the inherent greatness of people would make greatness arise and be permanent. I believed, as I wrote in Federalist number 6, that man is ambitious, vindictive, and rapacious. But that with sufficient government control, greatness is possible. As evidence that I am correct and Mr. Jefferson was wrong, I offer simply the entire history of humanity. Name for me a single utopian society that did not collapse into despotism. And for those of you who are still clinging at your Jeffersonianism, I have a simple question. When you left your homes to come here tonight, did you lock your door? If you did, you're a Hamiltonian. And so I am pleased to be with you for those reasons and more. And I propose that we spend the bulk of the rest of our time together thinking great thoughts, talking, answering questions and thoughts that you may have from your age or mine. I'll be happy to talk about anything you wish. I assume no one in this room is so gauche to bring up Mariah Reynolds. I'm watching you, sir. So I believe we're going to I have a manservant coming, and he is going to bring this remarkable device. Mr. Jefferson gave 3 speeches in his life. None of the speeches was heard past the first row because he whispered. He could not speak loudly. Happily for us today, we have these magic devices, which I believe are on either side. We have a lovely lady in the back and a reasonably looking gentleman in the front who will, if you raise your hand, bring you a microphone. You may ask a question, you may make a statement to which I respond. I simply ask that you be aware that there are hundreds of people here and we should not hear speeches. So let's begin here, shall we?
Sir, I have a question.
Now, in my day, addressing a founding member of the nation, one would rise. But perhaps you live in a more informal era.
My apologies, sir. Sir, you mentioned the Electoral College, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on the Electoral College of your time versus the contemplation of going to a popular vote versus remaining with the Electoral College of your time.
Well, the Electoral College in your day is very different than we envisioned. As I wrote in Federalist number 68, the fundamental notion was that if the people, as I wrote, elected someone who was by intellect, character, or temperament ill-suited to the job of chief magistrate presidency, the Electoral College would intervene and pick someone qualified to run the nation. Now, I'm told in your history this has never happened. Either you have always elected brilliant men, or the Electoral College has failed its fundamental duty. The Electoral College was an admission that Mr. Jefferson's mob might not have, frankly, the intellect or the information to make wise decisions. There was worry about a demagogue who I once wrote to a friend, if I was interested in seizing power, I would mount the hobby horse of popularity. I would scream, usurpation of rights. Pay attention to me. It's not dignified. And so if the Electoral College in your day has fundamentally failed its one job, I would consider making a change. What change you make is certainly up to you. Other comments or concerns? We have a person here.
What does it mean to be a great nation?
What does it mean to be a great nation? Well, I will confess that for me that's a difficult question to answer. I lived in a world where information could travel no faster than a galloping horse or a ship at sea. I lived in a world in which many people considered Africans to be fundamentally inferior. I wrote of Mr. Jefferson that he believes they are inferior because, as he wrote in the Notes on Virginia, they secrete more about their kidneys. I wrote, I'm proud to say, well, I should explain, I grew up on an island with 600 whites and 15,000 enslaved Africans, and grew up with a loathing of slavery. A great nation cannot tolerate slavery. Now, there were other abolitionists. Mr. Jefferson, frankly, was an abolitionist. His first sentient memory is being carried on a pillow by a slave woman. One cannot not be impacted by that type of life. He once referred to slavery as holding a wolf by the ears. You dare not hold on, but you must not let go. He freed members of one family, the Hemings, and no one else. I despise slavery, but I went a step further. The British, during our war, made what was a fairly reasonable offer to our slaves. Leave the plantation, join the British Army, fight on our side, and you will be free. It's a pretty good argument. So I propose that we do the same thing. And I wrote in my letter that I believed that the black man's facilities, faculties, abilities were the equal of ours. And any disagreement is a function of our education and not their ability. This, my friends, was a truly radical notion for 1785. I believed in the literal equality of black and white. But we did fight. We fought the greatest military the world had ever seen. And we fought them for a reason never before articulated in human history. We fought them for the notion that if you live and breathe, you should breathe free. The Declaration of Independence, as you recall from your study for tonight, is primarily, the main body, a list of grievances against the king. He's done this, he doesn't this, he hasn't done this. One entire paragraph that Mr. Jefferson wrote that was removed by the committee, much to his irritation, was on slavery. He argued that King George had inflicted slavery on the people who had done him no wrong. At the insistence of the Carolinas and Georgia, that was removed. Mr. Jefferson wrote I will explain very briefly. He wrote a remarkable document. There was actually a committee of 5 appointed to write the Declaration. It was Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Richard Sherman, Thomas Jefferson, and one more, less important individual. And Mr. Jefferson, as the youngest of the group, a young man, went to Dr. Franklin and said, "You must write this. You are the most famous man in the world." And Franklin said, "I will never again write anything that must be reviewed by a committee." So he went to Adams and said, "Mr. Adams, you must write this. You are 12 years my senior. You have much more experience." Adams said, "No, sir, Mr. Jefferson, you must write it for 3 reasons. First, you are a Virginian, and a Virginian must be at the head of this matter. Second, you are a much better writer than I am. And third, I'm obnoxious and many people hate me." And so Jefferson, without note, pen, or any reference materials, for 3 weeks wrote the remarkable document we now call the Declaration of Independence. And I would argue, in answer to your question, that what he articulated in the preamble and in the last paragraph is what it takes to be a great nation. We pledge our lives and our sacred honor to these ideas. So if you want to know what it means to be an American, remember the Constitution is nothing more than a contract. You can do this, you can't do that, mostly limiting what the government can do. But the Declaration is our national creed. A great nation would follow the Declaration of Independence. Let's see.
Sir, in your time, what would you have considered to be the greatest threat to the nation?
The greatest threat to the nation in my day.
And in our time?
In your time?
In our time, what would you consider to be the greatest threat? 2-part question.
Well,
Requires 2
I'm
answers.
reluctant to answer the latter. Jefferson wisely once said the earth belongs to the living. And for someone with my background, again, I mentioned 3-mile-per-hour knowledge, galloping horse, ship at sea. It's difficult for me to imagine a society in which, as I understand it, you can communicate. You have all of human knowledge in a gewgaw you hold in your hand. If that existed in my day, I would seek to exploit it commercially. We could sell the thing. No doubt Mr. Jefferson would want to dissect it to find out how it worked. But this is a remarkably different world. And so I will certainly say in my day, the greatest threat was uncertainty about the future. As Dr. Franklin left the Constitutional Convention, he was famously asked, "What kind of government have you given us, Dr. Franklin?" In his sedan chair because of rheumatism. He said, "A republic, if you can keep it." We were very concerned about demagogues. We were very concerned about unequal power. Much of the structure of the Constitution is, in fact, limiting the other branches. We always assumed that each branch, we assumed that the legislative branch as I wrote in a Federalist paper, would necessarily predominate because of their ability to make taxes and pass laws. That is why Article 1 is the longest of all parts of the Constitution. The executive, I believe, should have energy, secrecy, and dispatch, but he can't make laws, so he must await what the judgment of the legislature is, and again, run the day-to-day operation of the government. The judicial branch, we only devoted 3 paragraphs to because it was at no risk at all to us. They could only argue on what was brought before them, and as long as we had good men there, we would have justice. So, what concerned us was, this had never been tried before. This constitutional notion of no monarch had never seen the light of day. The idea that you build a nation on the principle of liberty alone was radical beyond what you can know. Now, you have a disadvantage because you know how it turned out. But at the time, only about 20 to 25% of the American public favored separation from England. The vast majority, perhaps 60%, simply wished to be left alone. So we took on the greatest military power the world had ever known for the principle of liberty to defend an idea never before articulated. So uncertainty, sir, would I think be our greatest fear. What will the next generation do? As to your day, I am startled. I'm startled by what you can do. I'm startled by your reach as a nation. And I'm startled by the fact that half of you don't vote. The most fundamental duty of any citizen in a democracy is to vote. And I am told, certainly not half of this audience, but half of the population does not vote. They are taking a gift and throwing it away. So in your day, I would say the low turnout would be my greatest concern. It is the greatest threat to liberty. Other thoughts, other questions, other comments, concerns? I see a hand way in the back. All right, we'll come to you next and come here first. I never asked dear ladies to stand, only gentlemen. So,
Sir,
I
I would like
though.
to ask you, you referenced Rogue Island. Can you tell us more about the gap period between the Declaration of Independence and ratifying the Constitution?
The Articles of Confederation period. People often forget that after the end of the war in 1783, there was a period of almost a decade in which the Articles of Confederation were our governing documents. And the Articles were designed to give state governments the most power and the federal government almost no power. As I mentioned, Rogue Island and others would vote against almost anything we tried to do. The provisions of the Articles required 9 of the 13 states to pass even the most minor change and required unanimity, 13 of 13, for any fundamental changes in structure. Which is why I called for the Annapolis Convention. Because we lived in a world in which, as you crossed the bridge from New York into New Jersey, you stopped to change your money from New Jersey money to New York money. Property rights in one state were not respected in another. You lived in 13 separate countries, each to one degree or another claiming sovereignty over fundamental human rights. This is ludicrous. It is essentially a response to the extreme to the Hobbesian world of a monarch, the Leviathan, as Hobbes called it, who controlled everything, and all he owed the people was security, and the people owed the king everything. George III loved Hobbes. And this was kind of a Rousseauian, Lockean rejection of that, saying, no, we're going to take all possible power from the federal government. And the problem is it just doesn't work unless your goal is 13 small countries that cannot get along together, cannot share a currency, cannot share postage stamps. If you wish to mail a letter to one to the other, you must get the right stamp. This was obscene. Now, it is true, technically, that the Articles of Confederation contain specific ways in which they could be changed, amended, or repaired. I, along with several others, called for a convention in Annapolis, Maryland. Only 7 states showed up, but we declared all 13 had shown up. And we took a vote to call for not a constitutional convention, but a convention to fix the Articles of Confederation. And that is what the Constitutional Convention began as. For some. For some of us, we knew this was nonsense. And it was our intention from the beginning to be rid of all of it. Mr. Madison, an ally of mine at the time, he actually, against the rules, took almost verbatim notes of the event, which is why you and your didn't know so much about what occurred. I, on the 18th of June, 1787, gave a 6-hour speech on the importance of... Do I have time to repeat that, sir? Do we have till midnight, or should...
No.
I shall summarize. Strong central government. It was realized that the Articles of Confederation were a failure. And what a relatively small group called the Anti-Federalists sought to prevent the passage of the new Constitution. And as you voted as a state, because of Lansing and Yates, the 2 gentlemen on the delegation with me, were both Anti-Federalists, until they left to go home, I was outvoted. But they left to go home before the big vote. And New York said, aye, we want to ratify the new Constitution. Then it became the challenge of ratifying the Constitution, which required, as a practical matter, it required 2/3 of the states. I should say as a theoretical matter, but as a practical matter, we knew we had to have them all. And we knew especially we had to have New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. We had to have the big states. And so I began writing, along with Mr. Madison and Mr. Jay, what you call the Federalist Papers. We published 2 a week. We initially were sending to each other for comments, but we became so busy at this that for weeks we just cranked these out. Mr. Jay wrote on foreign entanglements. Then he was struck with rheumatism and had to drop out. Mr. Madison wrote on the history of federations, confederations, and republics. And I wrote on every single line of the proposed Constitution, explaining that the Anti-Federalists claim that the Constitution would harm the rights of liberty of the individual. We argued, no, the Constitution actually protects the rights of the individual. And that only a large republic can do that, because in a small republic, demagogues can rule. But in a large republic, a majority will always rule. Indeed, you must have limits on the majority to make sure they do not impose tyranny on a minority, which is what the Constitution does in its 28 various rights. We published these, and states began to vote. Some states, it was fairly easy. Massachusetts was 128-0, largely because the constitutional proponents rescheduled the meeting and didn't tell the other folks. Virginia had passed by 3 votes. Can you imagine? 3 votes. There was a provision that came within 1 vote in the Constitutional Convention of being in the Constitution, which would say that a president can nullify, with Congress's cooperation, any law passed by any state. Can you imagine the difference in American history had some of the state's most egregious laws been voided by the federal government? But we lost by a vote. And so it was realized that we were replacing the Articles of Confederation, which had utterly failed. There was an interesting provision in them. There's a long list of ways in which what it takes to have states added, including the 13 out of 13, except one. Can you guess who could join the Federation just by asking? Canada. It said, should Canada wish to become an American state, they're in.
It's kind of the same today.
Kind of the same today.
Yeah.
Well, I understand there's 7 trees and a lot of ice. So the Articles of Confederation time was a time when you couldn't count on your pocketbook, you couldn't count on your currency, you couldn't count on your mailings, you couldn't You didn't have freedom to travel anywhere you wanted because you weren't an American. You were a Pennsylvanian or New Yorker or Virginian. I argued, as I said earlier, you must first and foremost always be an American. Happily, we did receive enough votes. Guess who the last holdout was to ratify the Constitution of the United States? Rogue Island. Years later. Strange people. Half that state's water.
I think we had one back there, didn't we? Yeah.
Thank you. You've spoken about freedom being a principle of virtue. How would a national bank help?
A national what, sir?
A national bank help the Americans
Bank.
to
I
be
apologize, I'm
free?
not hearing the word.
National bank?
National Bank. Oh, National Bank. Well, I created the National Bank. I want to say this carefully because some people, Jeffersonians, choose to misunderstand this. A well-managed debt is a national blessing. Banks, I wrote, are the nurseries of wealth. Here's the idea. Let us say you wish to build a house. Very few of you probably have the money in your pocketbook to pay for an entire house. So you take out a well-managed debt, which you call a mortgage. And by taking out that mortgage from a lender, you can employ builders and gardeners, you can employ plumbers and electricians in your days. You can generate wealth simply by the moving of money from one place to another. This is a well-managed debt. I'm told that in your day, your government insists on spending here and taxing here. This is not sustainable. But I'm also told that the 50% of you who vote return 9 in 10 of these individuals to their elected offices every election. So this seems to me to be unsustainable. But we certainly needed a national bank. At the end of the revolution, I had negotiated loans with the Dutch. I had done a great deal to support financially our war. You recall, I'm sure, the story of John Hancock signing so large that George can read it without his spectacles. One of the few things actually true. That happened. But what you don't know is that at that time, John Hancock was the richest man in America. And when the war came, he opened his pocketbooks, and by the end of the war was utterly destitute. He had given everything he had for the cause of liberty and died a pauper. This is a commitment to liberty. But banks, Jefferson once wrote, "I am against banks and the banking tribe." I argued that, as I say, banks are the nurseries of national wealth. But state banks, private banks, they can all be manipulated. I believed in a national bank. And so I arranged the creation, as Secretary of Treasury, the creation of a national bank. And in 30 days, if you can imagine a sum this large, it was capitalized with investors at $10 million. More money than in every other bank in America combined. And from that bank, we wrote loans to those who would build locks and dams, roads and bridges, later telegraph lines and highways. A national bank is vital to national success. Now, your President Jackson, a bizarre, horrible human being, would later rid you of the national bank, but you have created what you call the Federal Reserve System, which essentially does the same function as I've referred to by monetary policy, that is to say, controlling interest rates and such. But a national bank or some entity that provides that service is absolutely vital. And I'm quite proud of having been involved.
So I have noticed our citizens are asking very appropriate political questions, but
It is a dignified and polite audience.
Yes, a few of the Jeffersonians caught me in the lobby and said, make sure to ask him about Mariah Reynolds.
I will say this. I will tell you, but first I will say this. In my life, I was engaged in 11 affairs of honor. Had you asked that question in life, the count would now be 12. I'm not proud of this. Mariah Reynolds, sometimes called Mary Reynolds, but it was Mariah Reynolds, presented herself to my office in Philadelphia as a fellow New Yorker who had been abandoned by her brutal husband. And knowing my reputation for charity and kindness and generosity, wondered if I might be able to be of some assistance to her in her hour of need. She was a young woman of 23, beautiful. And I said, I don't have anything with me, but if you'll tell me where you are staying, I will walk to the bank on my way after work, and I will come by and I will make a small contribution to your well-being. Later, for circumstances I will explain, I had to write a 96-page, I didn't have to, I chose to, write a 96-page pamphlet explaining what happened. And of this event, I said, I appeared in her bedchambers, reached in my pocket and took out a note and gave it to her. And a conversation ensued in which it soon became apparent that other than pecuniary consolation would be an acceptable payment of the debt. And I was compensated. Quite a few times. Eventually, her husband appeared. This was a vile man. And it turns out that it had been a plot all along. He was essentially a pimp. She was a prostitute. And he said, I am outraged by your defilement of my wife. The only thing that can make this acceptable is $1,000. I didn't have it. I borrowed half of it and I gave it to him. And then I received 2 letters. And these must touch your heart. The first was from Mr. Reynolds saying, now that you have paid, I have no objection to you calling upon my wife as a friend. And Mariah wrote to me and said, I miss you with such passion that if you do not come to me soon, I will die. Now, I couldn't let the woman die. And so for several months, we resumed the affair. And finally, I said, this is enough. In fact, I'm ashamed of myself. During this time, my wonderful wife, Elizabeth, was in Albany staying with her father. I said, you should stay there. The city is not yet safe from mosquitoes. Stay up there. Time passed. I'm Secretary of the Treasury. And I get a visit from 3 men. Mr. Monroe, a minion of Mr. Jefferson, who would later be president. Mr. Livingston and one other, the Speaker of the House, Muhlenberg, I should say. And they said that James Reynolds had been arrested for speculation in public currency. And his claim was that, oh, I'm not doing this, I'm Hamilton's agent. So I was confronted with a challenge. I could admit to an affair of the heart, or I could let them think I had cheated the government. I mentioned my sense of honor. This is no issue. I began producing letters, canceled checks, documents to prove to these gentlemen that it had been an affair of the heart. They agreed. I provided more. They said, please stop. And they left that night saying, we are completely convinced of your innocence, of fiscal irresponsibility. In fact, I'll tell you this, when Jefferson became president, he had his Treasury Secretary do an audit of the books of the United States. Gallatin was the man's name. And when Gallatin reported back to Jefferson that under my tutelage as Secretary of the Treasury, the books of the United States balanced to the penny, he said, Hamilton has created a perfect economic system. There are no flaws. Strike one branch, and the whole thing collapses. It is a perfect economic system. Jefferson said, not Hamilton was great. He said, Hamilton hid his malfeasance, and you're not clever enough to find it. So Mr. Monroe kept copies of the proof I had given him. And when this splashed into the public affair in 96, I committed the first of two colossal stupidities in publishing, I will say in hindsight. I wrote this 96-page pamphlet explaining that it had not been an affair on the nation, it had been an affair of the heart. It was embarrassing, it was humiliating. But my Elizabeth stood with me. A remarkable woman. She lived to the age of 97, the last survivor of the founding generation. 8 presidents had her to the White House to talk about dancing with Jefferson and Washington and dining on fine silver. And when she was in her dotage, she and Dolly Madison each day, until she was 95, walked 5 miles a day checking on 5 different orphanages because I had been an orphan. She always referred to my Hamilton, and she was going to make it so that other orphans had opportunities. And in her old age, now former President Monroe was overcome with a sense of guilt, felt bad about what he had done. And he appeared, hoping to speak to Elizabeth, a woman that on my way to the duel I had said, the strictures of a Christian compel me to put my life at risk rather than risk taking the life of another. Adieu, best of women. Adieu, best of wives. Adieu. Mr. Madison appears in a room with a single chair already occupied by Elizabeth. And he gives his speech on forgiving and forgetting. And Elizabeth gazes into his eyes and she says this. She says, Mr. Monroe, if you have come to say that you are sorry, very sorry, for the stories and the misrepresentation and the slanders you said against my dear husband, so be it. But if not, no passage of time, no nearness of grave makes any difference. And she threw him out. Elizabeth Hamilton, a remarkable woman. Is that enough of inquiry for you, sir?
Yeah, I think that'll fill some tabloid pages, yeah. I think we have time for one more audience question. Casey, why don't you go over there?
I can do the 6-hour speech.
That's my job. General Hamilton, if a demagogue should arise in our republic, how might you suggest we generate the zeal from your time in this time when the Congress, the judicial branch seem to be either complicit or feckless in managing a demagogue?
This is a hypothetical situation.
Hypothetical.
Well, the first thing I would refer to is what I said earlier, that apparently regardless of what they say or do, you return 9 and 10 to their offices. So my first statement, sir, is run for office. You, run for office. Run for Congress. Find people to support you. Find others to be involved in politics. Find people to run for your school boards and your city councils. You cannot be lumps of coal and expect your democracy to stay. And so you must be actively involved. The challenge is a demagogue should never have gotten there because of the Electoral College, first of all, but because you should have refused to elect anyone like that. Again, this is hypothetical. Let's say Andrew Jackson, a vile man. After Jackson's inaugural, every carpet in the White House had to be replaced because of the tobacco juice spit on them by his supporters. Horrible man. Trail of Tears, just an awful man. Great general, terrible man. Should never have been elected president. But the people were enthralled. As I mentioned earlier, if I wished to be popular, I would mount the hobby horse of popularity, and I would call usurpation of rights. No, or as has been said many times before, no country can exist both ignorant and free. You have an obligation to consume news widely. The New York Post, the paper I founded, is a fine source, I'm told. I'm actually under the understanding that an Australian gentleman bought it. And that on the day before he took ownership, my picture appeared on the front page of the Post. with the statement, "Sorry, Alexander." You must be widely read, and this is an obligation. For example, are there any lawyers in the room? Attorneys, raise your hand if you're an attorney. And bold, I see a handful. How long did you study law, sir?
3 years.
3 years. That is a colossal waste of time. When I studied law, I studied for 6 months in the library of a lawyer, as one did then, took the bar, passed it, became one of 87 practicing attorneys in the city of New York, which was at the time 1/12 the number of prostitutes. I am told that in your day that ratio has been reversed, and it is not entirely clear that the situation has been improved. But the idea that you would waste 3 years on law startles me. But you must begin with the law. You must understand the law. You must read and study. You should read 10 to 12 hours a day. Sometimes, are there children in the audience? I hope not, because I've said horrible things tonight. But if there are, I would encourage you. Do you attend school, young lady? How old are you? 11. You're not working. Well, I encourage you to leave school right away. There is no reason to continue. And usually there's a small celebration when children hear this. But I say, here is the challenge. You must read 10 to 12 hours a day. You must read everything. You must read Livy. You must read Homer. You must read the Iliad and the Odyssey. You must read law. You must read Bacon. You must read constantly. Because only then are you a citizen engaged in keeping your nation free. Recall, please, what I hinted at earlier. The Revolutionary War was fought for a reason never before articulated in human history. That if you breathe, you should breathe free. That no man, because of their birth, has any superiority to any other. This is a radical notion because it challenges what was handed down from the pharaohs and before to our day. When we said King George is not chosen by God. We create our government. We, the people. We fought a revolutionary war over this principle. We took on the greatest military the world had ever seen on this principle. We handed you a victory in a revolution that vindicated the notion that people should be free, that they have fundamental rights as people. And today, far too many don't vote, don't watch the news, don't get engaged in the politics of their day. You ask how you rid yourselves of demagogue, you have an answer. Every 2, 4, and 6 years, we hold a revolution. We call them elections, in which the provisions of this nation allow you to remove anyone in the elected government and replace them with people with whom you agree, in whom you believe. But too many stay home. Too many are captivated by the music of the electoral scene. You have an obligation to be informed. You are the sons and daughters of a generation that took on a military never known before for that single reason, liberty. You are the spawn of revolutionaries. Please, I ask you, I beg you, do not give up that gift. Embrace it. And remember, we the people. I thank you for your time.
I am now pleased, first of all, to say thank you, General Hamilton, for your generosity of time and wisdom. And now I get to introduce the scholar behind the character. Ladies and gentlemen, Hal Bidlack. Hal Bidlack is a retired career military officer. During his years in the military, he served as Deputy Director of the Air Force Institute for National Security Studies, was posted to the United States Department of State in Washington, and was an ICBM launch officer and instructor. He also served at the White House as Director of Global Environmental Affairs for the National Security Council.
In a previous administration.
He spent much of his career teaching political science here locally at the United States Air Force Academy. Following his retirement, he served on the staff of a United States senator and as a senior research fellow at DC-based think tanks. Hal Bidlack holds academic degrees from the University of Michigan, including a doctorate in political science.
Go Blue.
Go Blue. He regularly portrays General Hamilton around the country and will be doing that several more times around the 250th here this summer. His work as Hamilton has been seen on both national and local television. His performances have been seen in auditoriums, libraries, museums, and around the country. He has performed Hamilton for a wide array of audiences, including federal judges, school children, and historians. Please welcome Hal Bidlack.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your time and attention. Great questions. And I do what's called the Chautauqua method, and that's why this out-of-character portion is important. Clay Jenkinson, that many of you recognize from local radio, formerly, I saw him years ago when I was teaching at the Academy on C-SPAN, and he was having a debate with a Hamilton who wasn't very good. And I contacted him about coming to the Academy, and we really hit it off. And he basically, he was tired of the Jefferson love that he always got. And just, oh, Mr. Jefferson. He wanted someone to say, now, wait a dang minute. You know, that makes no sense at all. And so he recruited me to do Hamilton, first on his radio show, which I did for about a year, which is easy because you have your notes. Well, as I said on the 14th, so I studied for a year, and then we did our first debate. We've done a couple dozen debates around the country, which is always a great deal of fun. And then I've done, for 26 years now, I've done these individual shows, which I think are great because, two reasons, I think. One, it shows that these people were real people. And that when I talk about Washington as the most horrid swear and blasphemer, I think that makes him more interesting, not less. It's when you think about what our nation has been through and who our leaders have been, it's remarkable what difference personality makes. So I think it's important to bring these people alive. And the other thing is, it also shows that not a single thing argued at the Constitutional Convention has been fixed in the last 250 years. Big state, small state, gender, race, religion, money, all those things are still issues before us today. And their persistence, I think, suggests that our Constitution does remarkable things, but still has some gaps and cracks in it. I was surprised not to get a question about the Bill of Rights being a foolish and dangerous idea. Hamilton had that argument. He argued specifically that if you have a list of rights, First Amendment that everybody loves, freedom of speech, it doesn't say freedom of song, so some demagogue could ban political songs, ban political movies, ban political concerts, or anything that isn't speech. He said we don't want to limit the rights to what is specifically listed there. It's dangerous. And he argued that time is a factor. I know that most of you can quote the First Amendment, at least in part. Many of you understand the Second Amendment. The Third Amendment, how many of you are deeply troubled by the Third Amendment? How many of you go to bed at night saying, please, don't let troops be quartered in my home against my will? The Constitution also says that you can have a jury trial for any crime over $25 in impact. That meant in 1788 a major crime. Now it's lunch at Arby's. So it's interesting. I think Hamilton was right about a lot of this. Nonetheless, the Bill of Rights has proved to be very important, especially the First Amendment. But it's so interesting to try to get into these people's brains and understand what they would think about today's world. They were remarkable folks. The average age in Philadelphia, if I remember right, was 41, and Franklin was 86, so he skewed it. So, I mean, this was a stunning generation of brilliant people we were very lucky to have. If there's a question or two for me that you didn't want to ask Hamilton, I'm happy to try to take them now. Or have I completely stated any interest you have in American history?
I would like to ask a question. So tonight, we're hosting this as a part of the Greenberg Center for Learning and Tolerance.
I'm in favor of those things.
I've gathered that. And over the years, we've done a variety of programs, including programs focused on religious pluralism and respecting different religions. Over the weekend, we had a group of people gather in Washington, D.C., who insisted this is a Christian nation, and they held a combination of a political rally and a worship service that called people back to God. And I'd love to know what your experience with the Founding Fathers has taught you about religion.
At least we can end with a simple, non-controversial issue. The Founding Fathers, none of them were Christians. John Adams is as close as they come. Hamilton had 2 periods in his life of religiosity on the island of the Caribbean, on St. Croix, growing up in that unspeakable poverty, disease all around, enslaved people. He was briefly religious. For the entire bulk of his life, he professed no religion at all. In fact, when asked after the Constitution why there's no reference to God in the Constitution, he said, "We required no formal interference from abroad." Benjamin Franklin owned a pew in every church in Philadelphia. Every church. Because he wasn't quite sure. We'll have to see who's going to be mad. So Hamilton, at the end of his life, after his son died, his daughter went mad, his enemy was in the White House, he'd grown strawberries and asparagus. He did have a period near the end of his life when he again professed religious beliefs. But none of the founders were. I mean I'm trying to say this very carefully because I'm sure there are devout people in the room, and that's absolutely fine. But you don't, as people have said over and over again, I think Voltaire originally, everyone can have their own opinion but not their own facts. And the facts are these. There were no Christians among the Founding Fathers. But the language of the time in our day implies that there were. And that's part of the challenge of it, is understanding. There are 4 references in the Declaration to nature's God, all put in by the committee while Jefferson sat there seething about these edits. All were put in, but not God, nature's God, which they believed somehow made it kind of a vaguely Unitarian kind of a thing. And there's one word that never appears in any of George Washington's writings, and that word is Jesus. If he were a devout Christian, I suspect it would appear once or twice. And so you can believe whatever you wish. I embrace those who find faith, but our founders weren't part of that group. And it is irritating, putting on my little scholar hat, very small with the spinner on top, when I see people of the current folks in power trying to subsume the founders as if they were Bible-thumping fundamentalists who really believed in the vision they have. The very first treaty signed by John Adams was a treaty with the Pasha of Tripoli, what they would call a Mohammedan nation. And it was an effort, there was a whole issue with sailors being stolen. It was a nasty time. This treaty says, paragraph 2 begins with this sentence: signed by the president, ratified by the Senate of the 1780s and 90s. It said, given that this nation, America, given that this nation was in no way founded as a Christian nation, we can do business. So in the first formal international treaty, the government declared that we are not a Christian nation. Now, what I've discovered over the years is that people who believe in any kind of religion running the world, it tends to be the religion they agree with. And so all I can say is, awkwardly, I don't have anything good to tell you about the founders in Christianity. We were not founded a Christian nation. But I think more importantly, and I want to hit this one last time, we were founded as a nation that adopted an idea never before seen in any government in the world, ever. The 4 radical notions of the Declaration. The government exists to serve man. We create our own governments. We'll run those governments, and when they're wrong, we will defy them or we'll overthrow them. We are the government. We are the people. The idea that we live fundamentally for liberty of all citizens is a more radical notion than any religious idea. This is a fundamental notion of human rights. And I think it's extraordinary that it took until 1776 for a nation to embrace it, and it took a Revolutionary War to settle it into our history. And I worry anyone of any strong faith attempting to subvert any country to that faith for their own purposes is, to me, someone to be very worried about. My 2 cents. Thank you for allowing me to go out on such a calm and reasoned note. This half is going to line up at the reception going,
Yeah, we knew that there would be plenty you would love to follow up with him. So we have planned a reception out in the lobby. There's some food, some beverages. The concession stand's still open if you'd like some wine or a soft drink.
More wine.
More wine. So we would love for you to interact with General Hamilton or Hal Bidlack in whichever character you prefer. Please engage with one another.
I will say that I have had people come up after shows and say, can you put the wig back on because I want to ask the general another question. And I say, you know it was me the whole time. It's just a wig. So yeah, but I'm happy to talk with all of you. So we'll see you outside.
Thank you
so
for
much.
being a part of this tonight. And please continue to support the Greenberg Center so we can bring programs like this to you. There's information in our program how to do that. Good night.